applause for his ability to bring together the thoughts. Uh, we now move to your questions, and it would be great if you could identify yourself, if there's a person that you're putting the question to. Also, if I can get a show of hands, it'll help me manage the process. One, two, three, four, five. We'll take three, ask for responses, take two more, and if there are any more, we'll take them. Daljit.
I'm Daljit Singh. I work for the Center for Energy, Environment and Resources. Uh, my question is mostly directed to, but if any of the other panelists want to come in, that would be fine. Michael, thanks. First of all, thanks very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to see, how other countries, UK and Germany, have made this transition. But I had three issues that I wanted to ask you about to see, which are particularly relevant to India, and to see how what's been the international experience with it, and also in particular what has been the UK experience with it. The first is that there's going to be a shift in our import dependence. So while we are now dependent on the Middle East for oil and so on, uh, we are going to be, for solar panels, we're more likely to be dependent on China, and then for lithium, probably Argentina, and for rare earths, again, China. So the solar panels, it may be easy to catch up, but it'll still take some time. And I wanted to ask you whether in UK, what's been that experience? I mean, how's the solar industry, the manufacturing industry been, or are you also dependent on China? And the next thing, the issue is about waste from, particularly from solar panels and batteries. And, the reason I ask this is because we had this experience with nuclear. When nuclear power first came in, people said it's going to be too cheap to meter. And then we found out how difficult it was going to be to decommission and what are the other problems with it. So I was wondering whether there's been any work on what might be waste issues. Because I've heard that there's some issues with some toxic materials used in this, and if you could say something about that. And the third thing is about the impact on coal workers. Now, I know UK has had that issue when there were the miners' strikes, coal miners' strikes. But what has been sort of the long-term effect on, on the lives of those people, and also in other countries where this transition might have happened? Thank you.
Okay. You have two mics coming to you.
Hi, my name is Preeti Malhotra and I'm from Ensign Global Solutions Private Limited. Just like to pick up from where Ashok ended. He talked about perhaps there's a need for the strategy to be nimble. And, Radhika talked about these transitions on the demand side, and we are still trying to understand what's happening. So that really, brings me to how the private sector should view this. Especially right now, the focus is more on creating large centralized assets, long-term assets, even in case of renewable. Because we personally are struggling in terms of getting decentralized distributed generation into the political narrative. So perhaps some thinking on that or some views on that will be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah. Akshay.
Akshay Jaitley, I'm a lawyer who practices in the area of largely renewables. Just a point to offer in terms of the linkage between the international and the domestic, in terms of the future of where our new capacity is going to come from. Now, this is very anecdotal, so which is why I'm putting it out to you to see whether you've seen some larger trends. But I struggle to see where capital for large build coal is going to come from in this country. For capital for new build coal is going to come from for India. Now, unless the government is going to get NTPC to build all the new coal plants, there is very little domestic or international debt or equity today available for a variety of different types of reasons, internationally from the climate side, domestically because of the lack of availability of capital, NPAs on banks, etc. So that, do you potentially see that as a link between what's happening globally and what's happening in India, given the increasing amounts of investment in India's renewable energy sector from overseas and the deep interest that people like me see from people who have deployed this capital successfully in Europe and now in places like Korea and Taiwan, and who are showing very great interest in these areas in India? And will that potentially shape the narrative a little more than perhaps we might have acknowledged till now?
Thanks. Let's take these three questions from Darjeet and from Preeti and from Akshay. Michael, maybe I'll start with you and then move down.
Yeah. So, that's right. I'll speak loudly.
This one is working.
Yeah. Okay. The issue of dependence on Chinese manufacturing or something like that for renewables is not really raised as a security-related issue. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is it's just seen part of the general approach to international trade. And why would you carve out renewables as an area where you were more concerned about buying stuff from abroad because it was cheaper than others? The fact being that once the systems are in place, it's basically the domestic renewable resource that provides the power. And so I don't think that is seen as a problem in itself. There is some concern about critical materials more generally, whether it's the rare earths or cobalt, and that's partly seen as, an age-old debate about, is it that genuinely there's a dependence problem, or is it that, if prices go up, the markets will adjust and find more stuff elsewhere? Like I say, the scale, because it's actually going into the capital that you're buying and installing, it's not seen as an energy security problem. What is seen as at least an energy issue is that to manage intermittency, you are doing more international trading, albeit for Britain it's with continental Europe. But there are talks about large-scale, both east-west and north-south power flows to help deal with the intermittency. And there remains a critical role for gas. And so you're in the world about debates about Russian gas versus LNG and Middle East. That's still an element in the conversation. But broadly, something which once you've bought it is coming mainly from a domestic resource is seen as a good thing for security. Waste, I think particularly seen as an issue in batteries, with the quite important caveat that by far the dominant form of batteries we expect to come with the vehicles. It would be transport plugged in, and that those batteries degrade over time for mobile use, and when they've degraded, you simply take them out of the car, stick them in your garage, and sell the services back to the electricity system. So it's not like they're expected to enter the waste stream rapidly, but again, there may be issues there to which we are not paying sufficient attention. Yeah, wouldn't disagree with that. The final question on finance, I know it's primarily an Indian question. Certainly, I've never forgotten the chief executive of the Carbon Trust, who was a businessman, but it was a publicly funded company. He said he'd never realized how different public money was from private. Public money is essentially national, and what's the returns? International money, said, well, what's going to be the general returns to this pool of capital? And I think, we are seeing a financial transformation as well, and certainly the scale of investment that's predicated, at least in the very low carbon scenarios, you have to draw on large international capital pools, which are very large, but they're kind of still a bit wary about the business model's case and maybe some of the obviously exchange rate risks, because all the stuff is sold domestically, not transferred back. So there's some hesitance in the financial sector, but I think it's changing under multiple pressures. Can I mention one other thing, which is actually around the data issue, which is, it was quite surprising, I confess, when I found actually in the UK, we have great statistics about everything that's connected to the national grid. When we privatised, we created the national grid as a sort of a private but semi-public and governed entity, and it knew where all the power stations were and all the data was published. And then on this committee I chair, when we look at the trend of declining electricity demand, that's demand on the national grid, because that's all measured. And even National Grid didn't really know what's going on at the distributional level. We don't quite know, we certainly don't know the granularity on demand. We don't even know quite how much is coming from distributed energy resources. And that's in the UK. So, you know, we ourselves, and that's because the view and the institutions were all structured around the assumption that what matters is the national grid and the stuff that flows through it. So, you know, we ourselves are struggling to understand even the data on the revolutions that's occurring at a distributional level. That's starting to change. Ofgem, you know, it's become a mini political issue to say, well, how come we don't even know what's going on with our own energy system? But of course, we've privatised it, so all of this data is owned privately, and they want to make money out of selling the data, and that's kind of, you know, that's one of the very current debates at the moment.
Radhika, Navroz, Ashok, would you like to add? Or we still have the issue that Preeti raised about how the private sector view decentralized distributed power generation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think coal. I mean, any major you know, bear in mind the term that Schumpeter introduced was creative destruction. You have to think about the destruction. And I mean, this was a furious and huge political battle, but it wasn't fought over environment. It was fought over the stranglehold that the mining unions had on the country's economy and the battle of Mrs. Thatcher. Some of you may remember the name of Conservative Prime Minister, who got elected on the platform of breaking the power of the mining unions. And it was traumatic for some of those mining communities, and it's taken pretty much a generation to get over it. And there was a lot of feeling that, you know, maybe some of it was necessary, but it should have been supported by much stronger social and retraining programs. And it left political scars that took a generation to heal. But it was not seen as an environmental, well, in a sense, environment got slightly co-opted as one of the reasons why this had to be done. But it was very much a sort of add-on to the narrative later on, and not a driving force. In Germany, you still have a bit of this problem. I think the other point that I'd observe in that is, at least for the UK, and I think we'll see in Germany, it's a two-stage process, which was, it was domestic mining that was tackled first, whilst the power stations were simply liberalised and said you can buy coal wherever it's cheapest. And that was abroad. So it was actually foreign coal that killed domestic mining. Once you are dependent upon imported coal, the political objections to getting out of coal are much weaker, because it becomes part of the energy security narrative, or at least there's not domestic production jobs at stake. So I don't think the UK could have destroyed coal consumption in the way that we have in the last decade unless we'd first basically got out of domestic mining.
So I just want to address Akshay's point, and yes, indeed, the cost of capital is something that India is strongly shaped globally, but of course there are many other points of linkage. I just want to say that when it comes to the cost of capital, whether it's domestic capital or foreign capital, they both have to deal with the risk of an uncertain purchaser in the DISCOM. So that sort of is a consistent factor across both of those. But I want to just sort of touch on another way in which the international story is really important. And that is that and it's anticipating sort of future sessions today. I think in India, we haven't had, not just haven't had a strategic conversation about our own policy, but we haven't had a really good strategic conversation about the role of energy in foreign policy. So climate sort of is just one piece of it, but obviously for China, their energy policy is extremely tied to their outward-looking position. Part of the whole Belt and Road Initiative is what they promise countries along that chain in terms of energy infrastructure. They are in a position to supply, whether it's coal that you want or whether it's renewables that you want, China has it. And so it's part of their diplomacy in a very big way. And that's something else that I think we could be thinking about much more strategically here in India. It's a separate conversation, but it's worth flagging.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Navroz said about the financing for coal in India, I think you did touch upon it. The truth is that today the only people building coal-based power plants in India is NTPC or state-based gencos. So private investment in coal-based generation is practically dead. If you look at the pipeline of coal-based projects that are in the pipeline, unless these projects started way back in 2010 and still have not got commissioned, those are the only private plants you'll find there. Otherwise, it's all state gencos and NTPC. And NTPC is buying up whatever few private players there are. So essentially, it's going to an era where it's largely going to be publicly run. To touch upon Preeti's question, I don't really have a very good answer, but I think one role for firstly, I want to, of course, distinguish between distributed generation and off-grid. I think distributed generation can very much be connected to the grid, and I think that's the way for India to go. We do have a grid, and the grid is a great balancer, and distributed generation can connect to the grid, and in that sense, I do see a big role for distributed generation. And increasingly, going back to the points I think Navroz also made in his presentation, this is going to be largely for even captive consumption, because given the kind of tariff structures we have, the regulatory structures that we have, we do see large industries, commercial establishments increasingly setting up their own plants or essentially doing bilateral deals with distributed generators and getting into that. And that could be one major area where these kinds of utilities have a role to play.
We'll take two more questions and that's the end of it. So, yes, ma'am.
One question.
I'm Professor Seema Sharma and I'm from University of Delhi. I have a question linked with, of course, there is no doubt about governance and as far as governance, it's the local governance, I guess. But then here my question is that what we look for and what we can expect local governance to play a role to make these all renewable energy solutions reachable to the communities, because still, for example, let's say solar energy, still not very popular, and common people are still not opting and going for it.
When you mean local governance, you mean what?
So local governance, like whenever we are talking about, it's a major city level governance.
City,
but
okay. So
but here, yeah, city is one. But here I'm also trying to bring in the local means neighborhood or district level governance. If I'm talking about Delhi, it's east, west, south, north, central Delhi.
Okay.
That
It
way.
is the municipalities.
Yeah,
We'll take one more question.
I have one more thing.
One please, and then we have lunch.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
I am Naveen. I work with one international organization called Lendesa. I was just reflecting on Radhika's presentation where she was pointing out about Delhi's consumption as average energy consumption is 3 times. I was just thinking it may be worthwhile to look at the energy use for bringing water to a home, which was there was a time when pulling water from the Delhi Jal Board pipeline to the storage tank at the ground floor and then pumping the same water to the overhead tank. So you actually need 2 electric motor in a house, which was, I am here in Delhi for last almost 20 plus years. So which was, once upon a time, it was illegal. But now it's like every house has, storage tank and the overhead tank, and they are using 2 electric meters.
The question is water pumping a major part?
That could be, like when we are saying air conditioner, cooler, refrigerator and washing machine, so it may be worthwhile to look at energy consumption for bringing water at home, which actually the responsibility of the water board to reach, I mean, that's what I'm just telling to Radhika.
Not that long ago, all of us used to depend on inverters to provide us electricity.
That's
Still
correct.
do in large parts of the country.
That's correct.
Okay. Navroz
Thank you so
and
much.
Radhika.
Well, it's an interesting question. I haven't given much thought to the role of municipal governance. I think that one of the areas that is going to be important is in this push towards rooftop solar installations. I mean, I think there are all kinds of sort of local regulations and rules that can get in the way of that, and that might be an area that in particular we need to focus on if the target on rooftop solar is to be met.
Yeah, I don't have a very good answer to your question, except to say that it is an important issue. So the water energy nexus and how it plays out in the sort of at the household level, at the city level, is important for us to consider. But we've had a hard time getting the data to be able to really know what the magnitude of that is. I don't know if you have more to say on that.
So this is data for energy use in Dwarka, which is high-rise buildings. Water pumping and lifts together account for 12% of the energy consumption. Air conditioning accounts for 60%. Right? So, I mean, sure, it is important, but when you look at it, as far as the big picture is concerned, it's not as important as. There's also, now I'm going to be, now I have the mic, and I'm going to speak for the next 1 hour. Yamini, is Yamini here? No, Yamini disappeared. Okay. It's one of the very interesting things that we are seeing, and I must confess this is not work that is complete as yet, is there's a large difference between energy use per square meter in Vasant Kunj and Dwarka. And initially what we had thought is exactly what you suggested, that it's pumping and lifts which account for the change. But the data shows that it's air conditioning which is driving the difference. Our working hypothesis, and please, this is working hypothesis, it is not yet proven, is that the much greater exposed surface area of buildings in Dwarka lead to greater air conditioning, whereas in Vasant Kunj, the buildings are no taller than the trees. So there's a lot of shading of buildings onto each other and trees onto buildings. But we have not yet conclusively shown that this is the case. As we end, I want to thank everybody for their participation. I also want to say that a number of issues have been raised which are important and which I hope would continue to be discussed in the future. I'm going to start with the last issue that Ashok had raised of statistics. It is my learning, and I think Michael said the same thing, data are collected for yesterday's problems. So when you have a problem today, you obviously don't have data. So when we started looking at energy efficiency, there was no data regarding energy use. So the challenge is, how do you make policy in the absence of data? And many a times, you have to kind of wing it, make something, put it in front of the stakeholders, and they say, no, this is wrong. And then they will provide you the data. So there are all, and then of course you bring in legislation that they have to provide data and all that kind of stuff. The other issue that I thought needs a little more discussion is the issue of energy use, lower energy use in same GDP. I'm wondering if this is because of behavior or because of the fact that both in equipment and infrastructure there's greater energy efficiency today than there was yesterday, or both. Again, I would like to see somebody decompose the data and show whether India is truly unique or is it part of a larger, longer term, secular kind of a decline in energy efficiency that occurs.
I think we do know the answer to that. China was the exception to the rule that countries that develop later are always more efficient. just because there's better technologies available. At least that's what the data seems to generally suggest.
No, I'm saying in quantitative terms, how much of this is efficiency, how much of it is behavior. The other thing is, when does behavior change? I'll give you my own example. In our family, we got a LPG connection in 1967. But till 1971, the LPG was used as a third source of cooking. The charcoal stove and the kerosene stove were first and second. As I remember, and obviously it's very long ago, so I may have faulty memory or selective memory, but it seems to me that when we got the second cylinder, which means that you had reliable LPG supply, that's when it became the primary source, a primary cooking device. Again, the point remains that a far deeper study of how people behave and how behaviors change are needed as we understand the curves that Radhika talked about. The last point that I'd like to mention, there are many things I'd like to talk about. We talked of coal miners. One of the good things that we have in favor is that coal use is going to increase no matter what we do till at least towards the end of the 2020s. So 10 years at least. And then it's going to decline. I'm looking at an economic transition, a political transition may be different. And then it's going to decline over the next 20 years. So you have 30 years. That's the lifetime, the professional lifetime of a coal miner. In other words, if you start planning, how many do we employ, which mines do we open, which mines do we close, my suggestion to the House is that there are opportunities of being able to manage this with far lower social costs as were forced by the Thatcher decision. I would end by focusing on one of the points that Navroz made, and Michael brought it out as well, is that these are transitions where both the politics and the economics are important. Consequently, political economy or historical contingency also plays a very important role. What we decide today in terms of rules, regulations, policies, investment decisions will determine what happens tomorrow. The point was made that the private sector in the renewables is today largely smaller players. There's a much greater degree of competition. But if they are more capital intensive, and if the capital has to be obtained from the markets, larger players will get it more easily. Does that mean that we'll see a transition? Quite possibly. But again, how we regulate capital flows, or how we make it more equitable, let me not even say regulate, how we make it more equitable will determine the shape of the renewable energy sector in the future. The exciting thing about transitions is that it gives us a lot of meat to talk about and to work on. Navroz, Radhika, Yamini isn't here. Thank you all for enabling this great discussion. Thank you all very much.